So it's been just a little over a week since Donald Trump assumed office as President of the United States for a second term, and he's signed a flurry of executive orders, many of which are upending not just U.S. domestic policy, but also U.S. foreign policy. He's also said that he hopes to meet with Prime Minister Modi as soon as February and hopes to discuss with him, among other things, more Indian purchase of American defense equipment, as well as, of course, a fairer trade relationship, as he put it. But let's talk about Trump 2.0 and what it is going to mean, not just for America domestically, but also for its relationship with its allies and partners. Joining us now is one of the world's foremost international commentators, foreign policy analyst, and of course the host of GPS on CNN, Fareed Zakaria. Thank you very much for speaking with us here on CNN News 18.
Good to be with you, Zaka.
Fareed, you've just come off the World Economic Forum in Davos. You've met with a whole bunch of political leaders around the world, business leaders around the world. I'm sure Trump and Trump 2.0 were the talk of town. What were they telling you? What are they most concerned about?
I think that the reaction to Trump 2.0 has been quite different from Trump 1.0. Many leaders feel like they will be able to deal with him just fine. That he's practical, he's businesslike, he wants to do deals. They see him as somebody who's willing to kind of make up transaction. I think they are all somewhat unnerved by the flurry of tariffs, the degree to which he really does seem to be acting on his protectionist rhetoric. Many countries regard the open world economy as having been the kind of highway that has allowed them to grow rich and raise standards of living and eliminate poverty. So there is that concern. But in general, I think it was quite mixed. The Europeans are very worried, particularly because of Ukraine. Asian leaders in general, more positive. Middle Eastern ones, probably the Gulf states, the most positive, because they view, in a sense, they are willing to do the most transactions. They are willing to, they have money and they think that that's what Trump sort of recognizes and respects. So it's not an accident that one of the first phone calls he had with a foreign leader was with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. The land where which is where money and oil flow. So it's been much more mixed, much more transactional. People are still wary, particularly because of the protectionism.
I do want to ask you, it's been barely a week since he assumed office for a second term, and there's been already a flurry of executive actions, from wanting to end birthright citizenship, an emergency at the southern border, sending troops to the southern border, renaming the Gulf of Mexico, saying that he wants to acquire Greenland by economic or military means, a whole bunch of things that he's done. And of course, off late, what he's done about, wanting to give voluntary retirement to 2 million plus federal employees, and that, of course, has been stayed by a court of law. Which of these moves, and there's been a flurry of them, do you find most problematic, the ones that could likely run into legal trouble?
Well, there's two different issues. One is how many of these are actually legal and will withstand court challenges. He already had one of them, which was the attempt to eliminate birthright citizenship. The idea that if you are born in the United States, you are automatically a citizen of the United States, has already been thrown out by a court. It is likely that some of these other things will also, at the very least, be circumscribed by courts. So many of them there will be pushback, there will be checks and balances. Part of the reason Trump is doing this is it's part of a strategy, which is kind of flood the zone, do so many things that it kind of gets the opposition confused, overwhelmed. They don't know which one of these various things to oppose. So there's a strategy behind it. In some cases, they know that these things are unconstitutional and will be turned down by courts, but they reflect campaign promises that are made. I think the ones that I worry the most about are actually not the ones relating to domestic policy, because there are lots of checks and balances in the United States. You have the courts, Trump has only a one seat majority in the House of Representatives, which means getting real legislation through is going to be much more difficult. The Senate will prove to be more difficult. It's not going to roll over. Many things in the Senate have to be passed by a two-thirds majority or by 60 votes. So there's all kinds of checks. The area where there are no checks is foreign policy. The president has enormous latitude in foreign policy. So you notice when he had that initial skirmish with Colombia, the country in Latin America where he was sending illegal immigrants back. He immediately threatened massive tariffs, and he claimed that he was doing so for national security reasons. Kind of not really, technically true, but the reason he did that was the president does not have broad authority to impose tariffs on a whole country like that. But if you claim national security as your motive, courts tend to be very deferential towards what you do because courts generally say, well, look, if it's national security, we're not getting involved. So there's a method to what he's doing even there. But the danger in foreign policy, the suspension of all foreign aid, the suspension of all programs, is that there the president does have an enormous authority. And what I worry about is that the area where Trump has virtually no guardrails is foreign policy, and that's where you might see some very major moves that could have very long-lasting consequences.
And Trump also had his first phone call with Prime Minister Modi earlier this week, since assuming office for a second term. The White House readout did stress on a couple of issues, which I think is important for Trump. One, he wants India to buy more American-made defense equipment. Two, he wants what he calls a fairer trade relationship with India. And three, to reporters, speaking to reporters on Air Force One, he said Modi will do right by the U.S. When it comes to the question of illegal immigrants. Could you elaborate on what Trump really wants India to do on these three issues?
Look, Trump is kind of obsessed with the idea of fair trade, or he's essentially a protectionist. There's no getting around it. Trump believes that a country grows rich by protecting its markets, by putting up high barriers. He should actually spend a little time and look at the history of India because India was the poster child of protectionism in the 1950s, 60s, 70s. It was exactly the method that India believed would give it prosperity. Protect your industries, shield them with high tariffs. Don't allow foreigners to come in and flood the market with cheap goods. It didn't work out very well for India. I ended up, decades of poverty, stagnation, and massive corruption. But that is what Trump believes. And so he is going to try to push India. Now, there's one element of it which could be very positive for India. India is still very protectionist. And one of the things that makes manufacturing difficult in India is you can't import the intermediate goods you need to manufacture things. Most modern manufacturing is largely an assembly job. And the things you have to import to do that assembly in India are very expensive because there are, 30, 40, 50, 100% tariffs on them. If Trump pushes India to open up more, that would be good for India. I think Trump is going to do something much more narrow, which is to say, I want India to buy more American goods, particularly defense goods. So there's an easy way for Modi to satisfy Trump, which is to do something, again, that is broadly good for India. India needs high quality defense equipment. It needs to wean itself off Russian gear, which is quite frankly substandard. Look at how badly it's been doing in the Ukraine war. Look at the Iranians had all this Russian gear, which the Israelis easily destroyed. The second part will be some kind of restraint on illegal immigration, which presumably means a slightly tighter system in India. I'm not really honestly sure what he means by that because a lot of Indians, as you know, overstay visas in the United States. They come on tourist visas or they come on student visas. They overstay them or they do other things. That's not something really the Indian government has that much to do with. It's the U.S. embassies and consulate could tighten their standards. But in general, what he's going to go for is the idea that you are going to do something for me. You are going to lessen my problems with immigration, with trade, with defense equipment. And if you can provide me with those things, you're in my good books. That's
Okay.
Trump's view of the world, very narrow, very transactional, and very much a kind of, I want you to do these three things for me. There's very little sense with Trump of any kind of broader public goods. We want you to play a bigger role in the world. We want you to provide peace and stability. We want you to, solve some of your problems with the neighborhood so it produces a more stable and peaceful neighborhood. Trump doesn't care about that. As long as you do those things the specific asks he makes, he'll be happy.
Well, one can understand this whole concern about illegal immigrants, but what about legal migrants? I mean, Trump has said that he is in favor of H-1B, but at the same time, this whole bid to end birthright citizenship that is hugely of concern to folks who are on H-1B in the U.S. As you know, I mean, children who are born to H-1B visa holders in the U.S. become U.S. citizens, and that Trump is now sort of throwing a spanner in the works. What does India make of that? Where's that coming from, and how does India sort of work around that?
Look, where that's coming from is Trump is a hardline anti-immigration person. He and his base is very strongly anti-immigration. Many of the people around him in the White House, some of his key policy advisors are anti-immigration, and I don't mean by that illegal immigration. If you look at the Trump first term, he basically instituted new rules and procedures that made every kind of immigration harder. Even an Indian businessman with a big business in India who was trying to get a business visa to come to the United States to do deals, maybe even to buy American products, found it much, much harder in the first Trump term to get a visa, to get one of those multiple entry business visas, because the whole idea was let's make everything harder on immigration. So where there was a one-page form, it became a four-page form. Where you used to have to get something certified by a nurse, you now have to get it certified by a doctor. Where the filing fees were $100, they became $1,000. And so the whole idea was throw friction into the works, make it harder for people to come to America, because when they come, some of them stay. It's a very parochial nationalist view of the world, far removed from the kind of Ronald Reagan open up America to the world, the shining city of the on the hill kind of philosophy. So that's what's underneath it. The birthright citizenship, I think people shouldn't worry about because it's plainly unconstitutional. It's clearly said in the 14th Amendment. It's been upheld by courts for 100 years. It's just very, very unlikely that something like that will change. But on the other side, you're right. He recently came out in favor of H-1Bs, but in the first Trump administration, he had come out against them and said he wanted to reduce them. He didn't do much about that. So you never know. Trump likes Elon Musk. He likes big businessmen. They tend to like the H-1B program. So he seems to have sided with them right now. But I wouldn't bet on that. The core of Trump's ideology and the MAGA ideology is very anti-immigrant.
I'll come to Trump and Elon Musk in just one second, but how can we not talk about the biggest story of the week, which is DeepSeek, the Chinese AI app, which seems to have completely upended the tech world. It has eroded in market value some of the biggest tech companies in the world: Nvidia, Microsoft, Google, Meta, you name it. What does this story really tell you about this global race, this global AI race between the United States and China?
It's very interesting. It's a kind of Sputnik moment for the United States. So I think the first thing it tells you in general, I think this is a very good lesson. Beware of hubris, beware of arrogance. When I was at Davos, I sensed an extraordinary degree of arrogance among the American business elite, technology elite. They all thought they were so far ahead, nobody could ever catch up. They had these hyperscalers had the kind of money that made it impossible for anyone else to compete. And look, we don't know enough that the Chinese company might be frankly fibbing, but we don't. They might have secretly used some OpenAI models, but on the face of what they're saying is that they use at 2% of the cost, they were able to achieve create a model that is as good as the absolute cutting edge models that are currently being used in the United States at 2% of the cost. They dispensed with many of the things that the Americans thought were absolutely essential, like pre-training and fine-tuning. So there's something. It's a real jolt to that hubris and arrogance. The second is the United States, actually under the Biden administration, not so much the Trump administration, put in place very significant rules and laws that made it very hard for companies to export the key pieces of hardware that go toward building AI models. The Dutch ASML company that provides the lithography machines, the chips that were the very high end chips from NVIDIA, all those were banned. And yet the Chinese were able to do this. And what it raises is this much larger question, which does involve India centrally, which is, can you really cordon off? Can you really, in some way, put in a box the Chinese economy? Second largest economy in the world, incredibly innovative, 1.4 billion people, thousands and thousands of incredibly innovative companies, and most importantly, hundreds of thousands of highly talented engineers. So if they have all that knowledge, how effective are you going to be at cordoning them off, cutting them off, isolating them, putting them in a box? And if you're not going to be, ultimately, if you're not going to succeed at this, what, is it worth it? Are you paying too high a price by disentangling, decoupling the global economy? The whole point of doing that was to keep the Chinese back, 2 to 3 years in terms of cutting edge technologies. I mean, they now seem to be behind by 2 to 3 months at most.
Since you were talking about investing billions and billions into cutting edge technology, let's talk about Trump and Musk. I mean, sort of conflicting reports. Musk didn't seem particularly chuffed about this $500 billion Stargate project, investment for AI. There are also reports that Susie Wiles, Trump's chief of staff, has restricted access between Musk and Trump. What do you reckon is going on there between these two individuals?
Well, Musk is his own person. He's not going to be intimidated by Trump. I think he loves the involvement and the attention and the kind of the becoming a political figure. I think people don't realize the kind of intoxication of being in front of large crowds and becoming a kind of political leader is a high that even the wealthiest person in the world doesn't normally get. So he loves all that, but he is his own man, and he's going to, you're not going to be able to control him. He's right about the Stargate announcement, by the way. The announcement, if you read it, is it's a wonderfully Trumpian moment because Oracle put in $5 billion, SoftBank put in $5 billion. That's 10 billion. They announced $100 billion investment and said it could go to 500 billion. So the gap between the 10 billion announced and the 500 billion that is being talked about is, I mean, that's Donald Trump. But when you ask him anything about, everything of his is, every claim he makes is sort of multiplied by 500 or 200 or 100. And so this is very much in keeping. I think the people involved all realize that Trump likes big numbers. So, come up with the biggest number you could possibly come up with. I think it doesn't speak too much to Trump and Musk's relationship. Trump, I think, admires Musk because Trump admires people who make lots of money. And, Elon Musk is the richest man in the world. So I think that is going to remain true. But his ability to have the kind of massive policy effect that he thought he was going to have, I think is not going to happen largely because of the nature of politics and policy. I don't. I think Elon Musk will quickly come to realize that the American government is actually not the federal government is actually not that inefficient. Now, what I mean by that is, of course, there are inefficiencies within it. There are inefficiencies in all governments, but the U.S. government, if you look at percentage of spent on administrative costs compared to other governments in the world, it's actually not very high. The U.S. government is a very efficient check writing machine. It writes checks for pensions, Social Security. It writes checks for healthcare, Medicare, Medicaid. It writes checks for veterans benefits. It writes checks for interest on the debt. And that's about 65, 70% of the budget. Then there's the Pentagon. And then there are some of the other domestic programs. So if you're trying to take out the kind of money he's talking about cutting the third of the federal budget. That's impossible unless you cut pensions and healthcare and things like that, which Trump has said he has no intention of cutting. So there's a kind of hard reality that limits Elon Musk's ability to do what he wants to do, do what he claims to do. But that's not imposed by Donald Trump. That's imposed by American political realities.
All right. Fareed Zakaria, it's always a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you very much for your time and your insights. Thank you.